The electrician's voice carried a specific, careful flatness that I would later understand was him trying not to alarm me before he fully understood what he was looking at himself, standing on a small stepladder in our nursery closet with a section of drywall already pulled away, holding a small black device roughly the size of a deck of cards that had absolutely no business being wired into our home's electrical system at all. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to come look at this before I touch anything else. My name is Camille Whitaker, I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the 11 months my husband's ex-wife spent watching our marriage, our home, and our infant daughter's nursery through a hidden camera buried behind our own drywall, the specific, quiet unraveling that followed once I understood exactly what that faint, barely audible hum I'd been hearing for months actually was, and the considerable distance I had to travel, both literally and emotionally, before I finally understood exactly how long this had actually been happening, and exactly who had helped make it possible. I need to take you back to the beginning of that renovation project, because the specific, mundane circumstances that led to this discovery matter enormously to understanding how something this invasive could have existed, undetected, for nearly a year inside our own home. My husband, Marcus, and I had lived in our house outside Portland, Oregon for just over 3 years, having purchased it roughly 18 months before our daughter, Iris, was born, a modest, comfortable 4-bedroom home we'd both fallen in love with primarily because of a bright, south-facing room on the second floor that we immediately, both of us simultaneously, imagined as a nursery someday. Marcus had been married once before, to a woman named Renata Cole, a marriage that had ended, according to everything he'd ever told me, roughly 2 years before he and I met, a divorce he described, on the rare occasions it came up at all during our own courtship, as amicable enough on the surface but privately, considerably more painful than he usually let on, given what he described as Renata's difficulty accepting that the marriage was genuinely over. I want to be honest that I never once felt threatened by Renata's presence in Marcus's history during the 4 years we dated before marrying, and during the first 3 years of our own marriage. She lived, as far as I understood, roughly 2 hours away, in a smaller town outside Salem, and the two of them had almost no ongoing contact beyond the occasional, brief logistical email regarding some shared financial matter left over from their marriage, a jointly held investment account they were still, slowly, working through the process of separating even years after their divorce had legally finalized. Marcus mentioned her rarely, and when he did, it was always with a specific, careful weariness rather than any lingering affection, the tone of a man discussing an unpleasant chapter he considered thoroughly, permanently closed. Iris was born 14 months before the discovery I'm about to describe, and the renovation that eventually uncovered everything began roughly a year after her birth, when we decided, with some genuine excitement, to finally convert an underused portion of our finished basement into a proper home office for me, work I'd been doing remotely from our kitchen table for entirely too long by that point. The renovation itself had nothing directly to do with the nursery upstairs, but our contractor, a careful, thorough man named Dale Higgins who'd worked on our house twice before for smaller projects, mentioned, almost in passing, during an initial walkthrough of the basement, that he'd noticed some unusual, unlabeled wiring running through a portion of our home's electrical system that didn't correspond to anything on the original house plans he'd reviewed, wiring that appeared to run, oddly, from somewhere near the basement's electrical panel up toward the second floor. I want to describe the specific, mundane way this discovery initially unfolded, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely unsuspicious the entire situation felt right up until the moment it very suddenly, completely wasn't. Dale mentioned the wiring simply as a practical matter, explaining that before he could safely proceed with the basement renovation, he wanted to trace where that unusual wiring actually led, partly out of basic professional caution and partly, he admitted, out of simple curiosity about what previous owners or previous work might have left behind that wasn't reflected in any documentation we had access to. I remember thinking, when he first mentioned it, that it was probably some leftover wiring from an old security system, or perhaps something related to the home's original construction that simply hadn't been properly documented decades earlier. Dale traced that wiring over the following 2 days, working carefully through our walls in a way that required opening several small sections of drywall he assured me could be easily patched afterward, and the wiring, it turned out, led directly to the nursery closet, a small, unremarkable closet on the second floor where we stored Iris's extra linens, a small stock of diapers, and a few boxes of clothes she'd already outgrown. I want to describe the specific moment Dale called me upstairs, because I remember it with a clarity that still, even now, feels slightly unreal in its ordinariness right up until the point it very suddenly wasn't ordinary at all. He'd pulled away a section of drywall at the back of that closet, behind a shelf we kept folded blankets on, and was holding, when I climbed the stepladder to look, a small black device, roughly the size of a deck of cards, connected to a thin cable that ran further back into the wall than either of us could immediately see. This isn't part of any system I've ever installed or serviced in this house, Dale told me, his voice carrying that specific, careful flatness I mentioned earlier. And this wiring, this cable running to it, it's not part of your original electrical work either. Someone installed this deliberately, and recently enough that the wiring still looks fairly new. I stood there on that stepladder for a long moment, holding a device I genuinely didn't understand the significance of yet, feeling only a vague, mounting unease rather than any specific, articulated fear, because some part of my mind was still working through entirely mundane explanations, a leftover baby monitor from previous owners, some kind of forgotten security device, anything that didn't require me to consider the considerably more disturbing possibilities Dale's careful, cautious tone was clearly already anticipating. I want to explain what happened over the following several hours, because the process of actually understanding what we'd found took considerably longer than I initially expected, given how little either Dale or I actually understood about the specific device in front of us. Dale, to his credit, suggested immediately that we not attempt to disconnect or examine it further ourselves, explaining, with a specific caution that I understood only later was entirely appropriate, that if this device was actually transmitting information somewhere, disturbing it carelessly might alert whoever was on the receiving end that it had been discovered, potentially allowing them to cover their tracks before we fully understood what we were actually dealing with. I called Marcus at work, my voice, I remember, considerably steadier than I actually felt, explaining only that Dale had found some unusual wiring during the basement renovation that led up to the nursery closet, and that he should probably come home to look at it himself. Marcus arrived home within 30 minutes, and I want to describe his reaction carefully, because I've thought about it often since, turning it over from every possible angle, trying to determine exactly what it revealed and what it didn't. He looked at the device Dale was still holding, asked several practical questions about where exactly the wiring led and how it had been installed, and expressed what appeared to be genuine, uncomplicated confusion and concern, the specific reaction, I want to be fair, of a man who genuinely had no idea what he was looking at either. I don't believe, even now, having had considerable time to examine every detail of everything that followed, that Marcus had any knowledge of that device's existence before that afternoon. I want to state that clearly, up front, because it matters enormously to understanding the specific, strange shape of betrayal this story actually involves, one considerably more complicated than a simple, straightforward marital deception. What we eventually discovered involved Marcus considerably less directly than I initially, understandably feared in that first confused hour, and involved someone else, someone who had never actually needed his knowledge or participation at all to accomplish exactly what she'd apparently set out to do. Dale, once Marcus arrived, explained that identifying exactly what this device actually was and how it functioned was beyond his own expertise as an electrician, and recommended, with a specific seriousness that finally, fully registered the gravity of the situation for both Marcus and me, that we contact a security professional who specialized in exactly this kind of technical investigation. We found, through a somewhat frantic evening of research and phone calls, a technology security consultant named Priya Anand, who specialized, according to her professional website, in residential surveillance detection, a specific niche I genuinely hadn't known existed as a formal profession until that exact evening. Priya came to our home the following morning, and I want to describe her specific, methodical approach to examining that device, because the clarity and precision of her explanation, once she'd finished her initial assessment, changed everything about how Marcus and I understood the preceding several months of our own lives. The device, she explained, sitting at our kitchen table with it laid out carefully on a clean cloth in front of her, was a small, battery-backed wireless camera and microphone, specifically designed for covert installation, with a transmission range and battery backup system considerably more sophisticated than any consumer-grade baby monitor or basic home security camera would typically require. This isn't something someone bought at a regular electronics store and installed casually, she told us. This is specialized surveillance equipment, the kind of thing used by people who specifically need something difficult to detect and capable of running independently for extended periods. I want to describe the specific, mounting dread I felt listening to Priya's explanation, because it was during this conversation, more than during the initial discovery itself, that the true scope of what we were actually dealing with began to fully register. Priya explained that the device transmitted its feed wirelessly to a receiver somewhere, likely a dedicated app on a phone or tablet, and that based on the device's specific model and its battery capacity, it had almost certainly been running, continuously or near continuously, for a considerable period, likely many months rather than simply weeks. The audio pickup on this particular model is quite sensitive, she added, which means it wasn't just capturing whatever happened specifically in this closet. Given the closet's location, sharing a wall with what I understand is your nursery, and the general layout of a typical second floor, this device was very likely picking up considerable audio from adjacent rooms as well, not just visual footage of the closet itself. I sat with that specific detail for a long moment, understanding, with a growing, sickening clarity, that this device had likely captured, for months, not simply footage of an unremarkable closet, but audio from our nursery, from Iris's room directly adjacent to it, quite possibly from our own bedroom as well, depending on exactly how the walls and ductwork in that specific area of our house connected acoustically. I thought, sitting at that kitchen table, about the specific, faint, barely perceptible hum I'd occasionally noticed over the preceding several months whenever I stood near that particular section of the upstairs hallway, a sound I'd always attributed, without a second thought, to our home's ventilation system, an old, somewhat noisy unit we discussed replacing more than once but never quite prioritized. I understood, in that exact moment, sitting across from Priya, that the sound I'd been hearing wasn't ventilation at all. Priya recommended, before we did anything else, that we not disturb the device further and instead contact law enforcement immediately, explaining that covert surveillance of this kind, particularly involving audio recording within a private residence, constituted a serious criminal matter in Oregon, one that local police would need to formally investigate and document before we did anything that might compromise potential evidence. We called the local police department that same afternoon, and 2 officers arrived within the hour, examining the device carefully, photographing its installation, and explaining that they would need to involve a specialized digital forensics unit to actually trace where the device's transmissions had been going, a process that would take, they estimated, at least several days given the specific technical requirements involved. I want to describe the specific, strange texture of the following week, because it existed in a genuinely uncomfortable, suspended state of not knowing that I found, in some ways, considerably more difficult to manage than the eventual, complete answer we finally received. Marcus and I moved through that week in a state of careful, watchful unease, both of us privately running through every possible explanation for who might have installed that device and why, without either of us, I think, fully allowing ourselves to voice the specific suspicion that had begun, quietly and independently, forming in both our minds separately. I remember, specifically, a conversation Marcus and I had on the 3rd night after the discovery, sitting together on our back porch after Iris had finally gone to sleep, both of us too unsettled to sleep ourselves despite the exhaustion of that entire week. "I keep thinking about Renata," he finally said, breaking a silence that had stretched for several long minutes. "I don't want to accuse her of something this serious without any actual reason to believe it's her. But I can't think of anyone else who would have any conceivable reason to do something like this to us." I told him, honestly, that the exact same name had been sitting, unspoken, in my own mind for several days by that point, though I'd been genuinely reluctant to voice it first, understanding how serious that particular accusation actually was, and how carefully it needed to be approached before either of us said it out loud to anyone beyond ourselves. The police department's digital forensics unit completed their investigation roughly 8 days after the initial discovery, and I want to describe the specific meeting where Detective Sarah Voss, the lead investigator assigned to our case, walked us through exactly what they'd found, because it confirmed, in devastating, undeniable detail, exactly the suspicion Marcus had first voiced on that back porch several nights earlier. The device, Detective Voss explained, had been transmitting its feed to a dedicated receiving application installed on a tablet, and the forensics team had successfully traced the specific account associated with that application back to a registered user. The account belonged to Renata Cole. I want to describe the specific, complicated wave of emotion that hit me hearing that confirmation, because it wasn't simply straightforward shock or anger, though both of those were certainly present in considerable measure. It was, more than anything else, a kind of retroactive vertigo, a sensation of an entire preceding year of my own life suddenly, completely reorganizing itself around information I hadn't had access to while actually living through it. Detective Voss explained that based on the application's own usage logs, which the forensics team had obtained through a formal warrant process, the device appeared to have been actively transmitting, viewed regularly, for approximately 11 months, meaning it had likely been installed sometime shortly before Iris's first birthday, a detail that struck me, hearing it, with a specific, particular horror given exactly what that timing meant about what Renata had apparently been watching during that period. I want to explain what those 11 months of usage logs actually revealed, because Detective Voss walked us through this information carefully, understanding, I think, exactly how difficult it was for both of us to absorb. The application's logs showed that Renata had accessed the live feed with considerable regularity throughout that entire period, often multiple times per week, sometimes for extended sessions lasting well over an hour. The logs didn't capture the specific content of what she'd viewed or heard during those sessions, only the timestamps and duration of her access, but Detective Voss noted, with a specific, careful gentleness in her tone, that given the device's location and the sensitivity of its audio pickup, it was reasonable to assume Renata had been privy to a considerable range of our private, domestic life during that period, extending well beyond the unremarkable closet itself. I want to explain what those 11 months of usage logs actually revealed, because Detective Voss walked us through this information carefully, understanding, I think, exactly how difficult it was for both of us to absorb. The application's logs showed that Renata had accessed the live feed with considerable regularity throughout that entire period, often multiple times per week, sometimes for extended sessions lasting well over an hour. The logs didn't capture the specific content of what she'd viewed or heard during those sessions, only the timestamps and duration of her access, but Detective Voss noted, with a specific, careful gentleness in her tone, that given the device's location and the sensitivity of its audio pickup, it was reasonable to assume Renata had been privy to a considerable range of our private, domestic life during that period, extending well beyond the unremarkable closet itself. I want to spend some time describing the specific, deeply unsettling process of trying to determine exactly what Renata might have actually seen and heard during those 11 months, because this uncertainty ended up shaping a considerable portion of my own emotional processing over the following weeks. I thought about ordinary evenings, feeding Iris, singing to her before bed, the small, private conversations Marcus and I had while getting her ready for sleep. I thought about arguments Marcus and I had occasionally had, the kind every marriage has, conducted in what we believed was the complete privacy of our own home. I thought, with a specific, particular discomfort, about more intimate moments as well, understanding that the device's location near our bedroom meant Renata had very likely had access to considerably more of our marriage than either of us could have ever imagined sharing with anyone, let alone with her specifically. Marcus, over the following days, grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn, a reaction I initially misread, in my own distress, as some kind of lingering complicated feeling toward Renata herself, before I understood, once we finally talked through it directly, that his withdrawal came from an entirely different place. I feel responsible, he told me, sitting across from me at our kitchen table roughly a week after Detective Voss's initial briefing. Not because I did anything, but because she's connected to me. Because whatever unresolved thing was going on in her head that made her think this was acceptable, it exists because of our marriage, because of history I brought into this house before you and I ever met. I understood what he meant, and I want to be honest that I didn't fully know, in that moment, how to reassure him that this specific guilt, however understandable, wasn't something either of us needed to carry, because the person responsible for what had happened was entirely, singularly Renata herself. I want to describe how the investigation actually proceeded once Renata was formally identified as the responsible party, because the legal process that followed took considerably longer, and involved considerably more complexity, than I initially expected. Detective Voss explained that the specific charges Renata would likely face included unlawful surveillance and invasion of privacy, both serious offenses under Oregon law, particularly given the covert audio recording component and the fact that the surveillance had occurred inside a private residence without any occupant's knowledge or consent. Renata was arrested roughly 2 weeks after the device was formally traced to her account, and I want to describe learning about that arrest, because it produced a specific, complicated relief rather than any straightforward sense of triumph or vindication. I retained an attorney, a careful, methodical woman named Deborah Ashcroft, shortly after Renata's arrest, primarily to help me understand my own legal options regarding a potential civil suit for damages, separate from whatever criminal proceedings the state pursued against Renata directly. Deborah explained that Oregon law provided for civil remedies in cases of unlawful surveillance, allowing victims to pursue damages for emotional distress and invasion of privacy independent of any criminal conviction, and she began, with my authorization, the process of formally investigating exactly how Renata had gained access to our home in the first place to install that device, a detail that had remained, up to that point, genuinely unclear. What Deborah's investigation eventually uncovered, working alongside information that emerged through the criminal proceedings as well, revealed a specific detail that reorganized my understanding of the entire situation once again, considerably deepening the sense of violation I already felt. Renata had gained access to our home during a period roughly 11 months before Iris's first birthday, when Marcus had been away for a work conference and I had, briefly, hired a house-sitting service to check on our home and our elderly cat while I stayed with my own mother for several days following a minor medical procedure that had made caring for both a young infant and the house alone temporarily difficult. The house-sitting service Renata had used to gain access, it turned out, employed a woman who, according to records Deborah's investigator uncovered, had a prior, brief personal connection to Renata herself, a connection that suggested, though never fully, definitively proven in court, that Renata may have specifically sought out that particular house-sitting service once she learned, through whatever means, that I would be using it during that specific window. I want to describe the specific, disorienting horror of learning that detail, because it meant this hadn't been some spontaneous, impulsive act of a woman who happened to have some existing, casual access to our home. It suggested, instead, a level of premeditation and careful planning that I found, honestly, considerably more disturbing than if the installation had simply resulted from some casual opportunity Renata happened to encounter. Someone had apparently been watching our lives closely enough, for long enough, to identify a specific, narrow window of opportunity and exploit it deliberately. The criminal case against Renata proceeded over the following several months, and I want to describe the specific, strange experience of sitting through portions of that legal process, watching a woman I had genuinely never spoken more than a handful of words to in my entire life account, in a courtroom, for 11 months of watching my family's most private moments. Renata ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges as part of a negotiated agreement, avoiding a full trial, a resolution that Detective Voss and Deborah both explained was fairly common in cases like this, given the specific, sometimes complicated evidentiary challenges around proving exactly what had been viewed or heard during any specific surveillance session, even when the fact of the surveillance itself was thoroughly, undeniably documented. I want to describe what I learned, secondhand, through the legal proceedings, about Renata's own explanation for what she'd done, because it added a specific, complicated dimension to the entire situation that I've found myself returning to often in the time since. According to statements she made during the plea process, Renata described a period, beginning roughly around the time of our own wedding, during which she'd become, in her own characterization, unable to fully accept that her marriage to Marcus was genuinely over, a difficulty she connected to broader struggles with anxiety and what she described as an inability to process the specific finality of that particular loss. She described the surveillance itself, disturbingly, not as an act of malice toward me specifically, but as something she'd convinced herself was simply a way of maintaining a kind of connection to a life and a family structure she felt she'd been unfairly excluded from, language that I found, hearing it relayed secondhand through my attorney, simultaneously somewhat clarifying and considerably more unsettling than a simpler, more straightforwardly malicious explanation might have been. I want to be honest that understanding Renata's own psychological framing of her actions didn't, in any way, reduce the violation I felt, but it did shift, somewhat, how I thought about the entire situation going forward. This wasn't, apparently, a targeted campaign of malice specifically against me as an individual. It was something considerably more disturbing in its own way, a sustained, prolonged inability to accept a boundary that had been clearly, legally established years earlier, one that had eventually escalated into genuinely criminal behavior that happened to land, devastatingly, on our family specifically because we were the family that existed on the other side of that boundary Renata had never fully managed to accept. The eventual sentence Renata received included a period of probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and a formal restraining order preventing any future contact with either Marcus or me, along with specific provisions ensuring she would have no legal ability to approach or contact Iris in any capacity going forward. I want to describe the specific, complicated relief I felt hearing that final provision specifically, because whatever else remained unresolved or unsettling about the entire situation, understanding that Iris herself now had a clear, formal, legal protection against this particular person felt, in that specific moment, like the single most important outcome of the entire lengthy process. The civil suit Deborah pursued on my behalf concluded roughly 4 months after the criminal proceedings resolved, resulting in a financial settlement that, while it could never fully compensate for the specific violation involved, did provide meaningful compensation for the extensive costs we'd incurred throughout the entire process, including Priya's initial technical assessment, the therapy Marcus and I both eventually pursued to process everything that had happened, and the considerable renovation costs involved in essentially, thoroughly rebuilding significant portions of our home's electrical and structural systems, ensuring, this time, with Priya's expert guidance, that no similar device could ever again be installed without our immediate knowledge. I want to describe, specifically, the renovation we undertook once the legal proceedings concluded, because it mattered considerably to how Marcus and I eventually rebuilt our own sense of safety and privacy within our own home. We didn't simply remove the device Dale had originally found. We hired Priya back, on a considerably more extensive contract, to conduct a full, comprehensive sweep of our entire home, examining every wall, every piece of wiring, every possible access point, to ensure nothing else had been installed that we hadn't yet discovered. She found, to our considerable relief, nothing further, confirming that the single device in the nursery closet had apparently been the only one Renata had managed to install, though the process of that comprehensive search itself took nearly 2 full weeks and required us, temporarily, to stay with my mother while it was conducted, an echo, uncomfortable in its own way, of the exact circumstances that had originally allowed Renata access to our home in the first place. I want to spend some time describing how Marcus and I worked through the specific strain this entire experience placed on our marriage, because I think it's important to be honest that this wasn't simply a story about identifying and punishing an external threat, resolved cleanly once the legal proceedings concluded. Marcus and I both, independently and eventually together, began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma related to privacy violations and stalking behavior, someone Deborah recommended based on her experience with similar cases. I want to describe one specific insight that emerged during those sessions, because it reshaped how I understood a particular tension that had developed between Marcus and me during the initial weeks after the discovery. I had found myself, during that first difficult month, occasionally directing a specific, low-grade frustration toward Marcus that I hadn't fully understood or articulated at the time, a frustration connected to his own initial history with Renata, as though some part of me held him responsible for a level of unresolved intensity in that previous relationship that had apparently, eventually, curdled into this. Our therapist helped both of us understand that this reaction, while entirely understandable given the circumstances, wasn't actually fair to direct at Marcus specifically, who had, by every available piece of evidence, handled his own divorce from Renata with reasonable care and clarity, and who had no more ability to have predicted or prevented this specific, extreme escalation than I did myself, meeting Renata only twice, briefly, at entirely unrelated social occasions years earlier. I want to describe the specific, gradual process by which Marcus and I actually rebuilt our own sense of safety within our home, because it happened considerably more slowly than either of us initially expected or wanted. For several months after the discovery, I found myself acutely, almost obsessively aware of every room in our house, every wall, developing a kind of hypervigilance that our therapist explained was an entirely normal, if exhausting, response to this specific kind of violation. I remember, specifically, several months after the renovation and comprehensive security sweep, finally beginning to feel, gradually, that our home genuinely belonged only to us again, a specific, quiet relief that arrived less as a single dramatic moment, and more as a slow, cumulative accumulation of ordinary, unremarkable evenings that simply passed without incident, evening after evening, until the accumulated weight of that ordinary safety finally outweighed the residual unease. I want to describe, briefly, what eventually happened with Iris as she's grown older, because I've thought considerably about how, or whether, to eventually explain any of this to her once she's old enough to understand it. She was far too young during the actual events to have any memory of them herself, a small mercy I've held onto throughout this entire process. Marcus and I have discussed, at length, that we'll eventually tell her an age-appropriate version of what happened, understanding that as she grows older, some version of this story, involving her father's previous marriage and the specific, extreme difficulty one person had accepting its ending, will likely become relevant to her own understanding of our family's history, though we've deliberately chosen not to rush that particular conversation before she's genuinely ready to process it. I think often, still, about that faint, barely perceptible hum I'd noticed for months before Dale's discovery, a sound I'd attributed, without a second thought, to nothing more significant than an aging ventilation system. I think about how close I came to never fully understanding what that sound actually was, if Dale hadn't happened to notice unusual wiring during an entirely unrelated basement renovation, if that specific, particular thread hadn't happened to unravel exactly when and how it did. I understand, with considerable distance now from those initial, devastating weeks, that whatever safety and privacy Marcus and I eventually rebuilt within our own home exists specifically because we trusted a professional's careful, methodical caution rather than dismissing an unusual detail as simply another ordinary, forgettable feature of an older house's imperfect systems. If you've made it this far with me tonight, I want to ask you something honestly, something I've turned over often in the 2 years since Dale first called me up that stepladder to look at what he'd found. If you discovered that your own home had been secretly monitored for nearly a year by someone from your spouse's past, someone who had never fully accepted a boundary the law itself had already, formally established, would you have wanted to understand every detail of what they'd actually seen and heard, or would some part of you have preferred not knowing, understanding that some specific knowledge, once acquired, can never fully be set back down again? I read every single comment on these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your answer tonight, while this is still sitting fresh with you. Tell me exactly where you're watching from, and tell me honestly whether you think Marcus and I handled the aftermath of this discovery in the right way, or whether you think there's something we should have done differently, given everything we eventually learned. And if this story reached something real in you tonight, don't just close this video and move on to whatever comes next, subscribe right now, because the stories waiting for you here are exactly the kind that people tell me, again and again, that they think about for days afterward. I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.